Hey, it's Christopher, and today I've gathered stories where bear spray didn't just fail, it got people eaten alive. From a man who threw his canister at a bear instead of ever spraying it, to someone in India who believed a homemade deterrent could stop a sloth bear. But first, we start on a private ranch, where a 28-year-old covered his own body in bear spray was the move that would be enough to deter a bear. It was August 17th, 2015, and weak afternoon light filtered through the warped timber walls of a half-abandoned agricultural complex on the outskirts of Brașov, Romania. On this afternoon, it would become the last place Benny ever stood upright. Benjamin Benny Cordell was 28 years old, a construction worker from Oregon who had relocated to Eastern Europe. His YouTube channel had fewer than 50 subscribers. Those who had watched described his content as escalation-driven, fire endurance clips, controlled falls, and improvised stunts built more around shock value than structured training. It seemed to me like he treated danger as currency and warnings as noise. What Benny likely did not appreciate was the predator waiting at the far end of that barn. The bear brought in for the shoot was a 9-year-old male named Max, housed in a pen of welded scrap fencing and repurposed steel panels. Eurasian brown bears are the most widespread brown bear subspecies across Europe and Western Russia. Adult males commonly weigh between 550 and 770 pounds, dense with muscle, bone, and evolutionary precision. Their forelimbs can deliver bone-shattering force, and territorial aggression intensifies sharply with age. Max had been habituated to human presence during controlled feeding demonstrations, but never to uncontrolled proximity in an enclosed structure. The barn offered no reassurance, a single metal door that stuck when closed, gaps throughout the walls, no secondary barriers, no recognized safety standards. Dobre was the only person present who fully understood what any of that meant. Benny arrived with bear spray, but not for defense. He intended to coat himself in it, inspired by popular stunt videos. Dobre said that he warned him directly. Aerosol capsaicin in an enclosed space would affect everyone inside, and may have contributed to escalating the animal's reaction in unpredictable ways. Benny ignored the warning. The camera was running. Within minutes, he discharged the first canister over his jacket and arms, screaming and laughing as his friend recorded. The aerosol lingered in the still air, building into a visible haze. His friend began coughing, turning away from the lens. At the far end of the structure, Max began pacing. Short, low vocalizations, shifting quickly into repeated lunging at the barrier. Anchor bolts strained audibly against the steel posts. Dobre moved toward the enclosure to resecure the lead, then hesitated as the chemical cloud thickened around him. Benny discharged a second canister. The fencing was not designed to absorb sustained impact. When Max broke through, the failure cascaded, one gate latch giving first, followed by anchor points, then welded panels collapsing in sequence. The distance closed in under seconds. The first contact drove Benny sideways into a timber support post that cracked on impact. He hit the ground before he could regain footing. What followed was not a single strike. There was a brief reorientation, a second surge forward, then repeated contact at close range. Dobre attempted to intervene with a metal pole, but was forced back by the collapsed fencing between him and the animal. His friend retreated to the far wall, weeping, and called emergency services from a mobile phone. By the time responders arrived, Benny Cordell was dead. Max had not attacked out of malice. He had responded, with everything evolution had given him, to chemical disorientation, confined space, and an uncontrolled human presence that had entered his territory without warning. The property was partially dismantled during an unrelated inspection sweep months afterward. The footage was seized by investigators during the initial inquiry and was never publicly released. Dobre was questioned but faced no formal charges. The informal network of private handlers through which Max had passed was never fully traced. Now, I have no sympathy to extend here. Benny was warned, clearly and more than once, by someone who actually knew what they were talking about. He ignored it because a camera was running. That is not bravery. That is the most ordinary kind of fatal stupidity there is. Alright, this next one genuinely baffled me. The guy had bear spray in his hand, and it still managed to make everything worse. It was July 9th, 2016, along a gravel pull-off on the Denali Highway, mile marker 118, where the asphalt gives way to raw Alaska and the tree line swallows everything that moves. Brock Marin, 34, spent most of his off time in Wasilla watching football and tinkering with small engines. The camping trip had been his girlfriend Dara's idea. She'd grown up in rural Montana and had pushed for it repeatedly. Brock had no prior camping experience, owned no outdoor gear, and had purchased the bear spray the morning they left, still in the cardboard packaging when they pitched the tent. He seems like a pushover to me. A black bear had been working the tree line adjacent to the campsite for at least 20 minutes before the incident. American black bears in interior Alaska are not the timid garbage raiders of the lower 48. Adult males in this region regularly exceed 400 pounds, sustained by dense summer foraging. They are fast over short ground, capable of 25 miles per hour across rough terrain, and when agitated, their behavior escalates with little transition between curious and aggressive. They are not naturally predatory toward humans, but they respond to sudden movement, unfamiliar scent, and perceived threat with speed that most people are cognitively unprepared to process. Dara's small mixed-breed dog, tied to a stake near the fire ring, began barking and then broke its lead. The bear gave chase. Neither Brock nor Dara retreated to their truck, which was 40 feet away. Dara moved toward the passenger door, but stopped when Brock turned toward the animal. A hiker named Petrov, camped roughly 60 yards down the pull-off with a clear sightline, later told rangers he had watched the bear circling the campsite for several minutes before the dog bolted and had been preparing to call out a warning. Brock grabbed the bear spray canister from the picnic table. He ripped off the safety clip, but instead of properly aiming it, he overhand threw the canister toward the bear like a makeshift grenade. It struck the animal near the left shoulder and dropped into the brush. At this point, as I read through the story, I'm facepalming in real time. The bear halted its pursuit of the dog. It turned toward Brock. Petrov later described a brief, unnatural stillness before it lowered its head and began advancing in a direct, steady line, closing distance with deliberate pressure before dropping fully into motion. Brock ran toward the truck, but the terrain was uneven, wet from the previous night's rain. He slipped and went down hard on his left knee within the first 10 feet. He did not get back up before the bear reached him. Dara, now inside the truck, reported hearing the impact, a sound she described to rangers as similar to something being dropped from height onto wet ground. The bear first used its forepaws, knocking Brock off balance and collapsing his left side as he fell back into the ground cover. He tried to curl away, but the animal followed immediately, switching from swats to a bite aimed at his upper torso, shaking him. The combination of force and weight did most of the damage in seconds, leaving him unable to move or respond. Petrov, who remained at distance, said the attack continued for what he estimated was between 90 seconds and 2 minutes before the bear disengaged and moved back into the brush. Brock was non-responsive before it left. Petrov activated his satellite communicator, and rangers reached the site moments later, only pronouncing death on sight. The coroner's report noted blunt force and lacerating trauma to the thoracic cavity, left arm, and neck consistent with bear attack. Cause of death was hemorrhagic shock, secondary to multiple deep lacerations and crush injury. Time of death was estimated within minutes of the attack. Wildlife officers flagged the incident under improper deterrent use. The bear was never located. I think Brock was not a reckless man. He was simply a man handed a tool he had never been shown how to use in a situation he had never been trained to assess. That gap is the tragedy here. Not stupidity, but genuine unpreparedness, treated as a minor detail right up until it wasn't. Now, unlike Brock, who didn't know how to use bear spray, this next man was aware of it, and yet it still didn't matter to the apex predator. It was June 14, 2016, outside Cody, Wyoming, where the Absaroka Range cuts into the sky like broken teeth and the wind carries the smell of pine and something older. The kind of country that doesn't negotiate. Evan James Mallory, 31, worked IT support for a mid-sized logistics company in Boise, Idaho. He was the guy who fixed your printer and quietly resented it. What gave him purpose was the Pacific Northwest LARP community, where he played a druid named Caldenmore the Patient. He was respected in that world, a scene coordinator, a lore keeper, someone people listened to. He'd driven 9 hours to attend the Renaissance Fair near Cody with his girlfriend, Priya Nath. The fair was incidental. For Evan, the Absaroka backcountry was the real draw. Priya later said that he'd mentioned more than once that getting into character meant getting into nature. The trail they took climbed a sagebrush slope above the Shoshone River basin, opening into a subalpine clearing roughly 2 miles from the trailhead. Grizzly bears in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem are not rare. Population estimates in 2016 placed over 700 animals in the region. Adult males average 400 to 600 pounds and can sprint 35 miles per hour. Their charge response can be triggered by sudden arm movement, direct eye contact, or perceived advance into their space. Bears in early summer are calorie deficient after hibernation, which elevates aggression. A trail information board at the trailhead posted an active bear warning, recent grizzly sightings within a mile of the area. A ranger had also verbally flagged it to fair attendees that morning. Priya later told investigators she remembered seeing the sign. She also said Evan had pointed up the ridge and said something to the effect that the bear was far enough and that he wanted to see how close he could get before it moved off. He carried bear spray clipped to his satchel. She stayed back. Evan moved upslope toward the ridge. The bear, an adult male, was roughly 80 yards out, but already moving along the tree line and slowly closing distance toward the same drainage, feeding and drifting between brush patches. By the time Evan stopped, the space between them had narrowed to about 40 yards, with the bear now fully aware of their presence. Evan raised his staff with one arm extended wide, a gesture pulled from his LARP lexicon, meant to signal peaceful intent. The sudden arm movement likely contributed to the bear's shift in attention. The bear stopped feeding. What happened next took under 6 seconds. The grizzly dropped its head and came straight downhill. Evan reached behind his back for the bear spray. The wind was blowing toward him at roughly 10 miles per hour. He discharged the canister only when the bear had closed to roughly 25 feet. The spray blew back directly into his face at close range. He went down immediately, partially blinded and choking. The staff fell. The bear did not slow. The first contact knocked Evan backward onto the slope. The bear bit into his left shoulder and shook, dislocating the joint and fracturing the clavicle before shifting its attention higher toward his head. Priya ran downhill screaming. A day hiker lower on the trail heard her and called 911. Terrain delayed emergency response to approximately 32 minutes. Mallory was pronounced dead at the scene by rescue personnel after a brief field assessment. Within the LARP community, Evan's death prompted a brief wave of posts and tribute sessions, where participants shared memories of his character work and coordination efforts. An in-character memorial event was held in his honor, but the discussion surrounding the incident quickly shifted toward safety boundaries. In outdoor roleplay settings, I don't mock Evan Mallory. He was someone who built meaning through imagination, and that's not a character flaw, but imagination has no authority over 500 pounds of bear. The costume, the staff, the gesture, none of it meant anything to the animal coming down that ridge. It never does. Meanwhile, the next person I'm going to tell you about genuinely believed she was doing the right thing. No costume, no character, just a conviction that turned fatal. It was September 3rd, 2014, at the Brașov Regional Zoo in central Romania, and the maintenance lights along the Eastern Animal Corridor had been flickering for 3 days. Minor fault no one had gotten around to fixing, in a zoo where minor faults had a habit of becoming something worse. Elena Varga was 26, unemployed for 8 months, and had spent most of that time online. She had grown up in Cluj-Napoca, the daughter of a retired schoolteacher, and had briefly studied veterinary medicine before withdrawing in her second year. People who knew her described her as passionate and sincere, but increasingly isolated. Her social media activity in the months before September showed a fixation on captive animal welfare, particularly on Mika, a 9-year-old Eurasian brown bear housed at the Brașov facility. Elena had posted repeatedly that Mika's enclosure was too small, that his repetitive pacing was proof of psychological collapse, and that the zoo was willfully ignoring his deterioration. The Brașov Regional Zoo sat at the edge of a forested hillside, its older enclosures built to 1970s Eastern European standards, functional, minimal, not designed with modern safety redundancies in mind. Mika was a male Eurasian brown bear, standing roughly 6.5 feet tall on his hind legs, and weighing an estimated 520 pounds. They are not aggressive by default, but they are profoundly territorial, and a confined bear with no outlet for flight behavior will default to confrontation when that territory is breached. Elena arrived at the zoo after closing, sometime around 8:40 p.m. She had brought a commercial bear spray canister, a deterrent product designed to temporarily incapacitate bears at a distance, not kill them. However, she claimed in an online post that in sufficient quantity it could be used humanely to euthanize an animal. This is medically and chemically false. She accessed the facility through an unsecured maintenance gate on the eastern perimeter, a known weak point that had been flagged in an internal safety memo 6 weeks earlier and had not been addressed. A keeper named Andrei Florescu was conducting a late equipment check in the service corridor adjacent to the bear enclosure when he saw Elena drop down from the interior gate lip and land inside the paddock. He triggered the enclosure alarm immediately and began shouting at her through the fence. Elena did not leave. Mika, who had been resting near the far wall, oriented toward her within seconds of her landing. He did not charge immediately. He stood, watched, and began to move in a low, deliberate walk that experienced handlers recognize as threat assessment. Elena raised the bear spray and discharged it. The enclosure's partial roof and internal ventilation created a lateral draft that pushed the cloud sideways and away from the bear. Mika continued forward. She discharged the canister a second time. It produced a short, weakened burst and was likely affected by short standoff distance and enclosure airflow disrupting dispersion, effectiveness. Poor aim combined with unstable airflow, reducing any meaningful cloud formation or coverage. She was now without any effective deterrent and approximately 15 feet from a 520-pound animal that had closed more than half the distance between them. Mika struck her with a downward swipe to the left shoulder that dropped her to the ground and fractured her clavicle and 2 ribs simultaneously. What followed was a rapid and chaotic series of bites, pushing, and crushing body weight. He pinned her with his body mass, and the injuries sustained to her skull, neck, and thoracic cavity in the following short interval of under 2 minutes were unsurvivable. Andre called emergency services from outside the fence while using a metal feed pole to strike the outer barrier and create noise. Response teams arrived 18 minutes later. Access delays through the zoo's locked secondary corridors pushed intervention to 26 minutes total. They could only declare Elena dead at the scene. In the weeks following, Romanian animal rights groups split sharply, some framing Elena as a martyr to captive animal welfare, others refusing to eulogize someone whose actions got an animal nearly killed. I think it's sad to think that Elena genuinely believed she was saving something. That belief was not grounded in any reality Mika was capable of understanding, and it cost her everything while changing nothing for him. Alright, this next one genuinely got under my skin, because at least Elena believed she was doing something for the animal. This next guy wasn't trying to save anything, he just wanted to see if his homemade concoction would actually work. It was May 12th, 2018, in the forested buffer zone flanking Jim Corbett National Park in Uttarakhand, India, where the canopy pressed so thick that midday light barely reached the ground, and Langor alarm calls moved through the understory in pulses that went largely unheeded by the group. Ravi Deshmukh, 29, worked as a line cook at a mid-range hotel in Ramnagar, a town on the park's edge. Among his circle, he was the person who always had answers. Confident, unexamined, persuasive. He had no background in wildlife or chemistry. According to his friends, he had spent 2 evenings reading about commercial bear spray online, then mixed concentrated chili extract with water and rubbing alcohol, pouring it into a repurposed cologne bottle. He had concluded the capsaicin content was adequate and told his 4 companions as much, several times on the drive out. I don't think Ravi had any way of measuring the concentration of his concoction. The trip was a casual forest walk with no guide, no permits, and no particular plan. The corridor they entered is established sloth bear habitat. Sloth bears weigh between 120 and 310 pounds and carry claws up to 3 inches long. They have poor eyesight and startle at close range without warning, attacking the face and skull rather than the torso. They account for more mauling deaths in India than any other large carnivore. A forest department signboard at the trailhead warned against entry without a licensed guide and noted active bear sightings in the area. Fruiting season pulls sloth bears into peripheral zones closer to human access points. As the group approached the tree line, a farmer crossing a nearby field called out to them and gestured toward the forest. Ravi waved and kept walking. 40 minutes in, one of the group spotted movement near a cluster of bur trees. The bear was feeding roughly 80 feet out, its back to them, claws hooked into the lower branches. Ravi separated from the group and moved toward it. He closed to approximately 15 feet and pressed the nozzle on the cologne bottle. The spray came out in an uneven, low-pressure stream rather than a mist, failing to form a directed aerosol cloud and breaking apart almost immediately in midair, dispersing well short of the animal. No effective concentration of capsaicin reached the bear. The bear turned. It did not bluff or vocalize. It dropped from the branch and covered the ground in under 2 seconds. The first impact drove Ravi backward off his feet. His companions watched 30 feet behind him. According to them, the first swat pinned him flat, claws raking across his cheek and forehead. Before he could orient, the bear's jaws closed over the front of his face, teeth finding purchase around the orbital ridge and upper jaw, then releasing and rebiting in short, forceful motions. The animal remained over him, shifting its weight forward as it continued targeting the head and neck, exactly where sloth bear attacks concentrate damage. The attack stayed tight and controlled at close range, with the bear maintaining contact the entire time, adjusting its stance as Ravi's movement slowed, then ceased altogether under the sustained force. 3 of the friends ran immediately. 1, Prakash, stayed at the tree line. He could not reach Ravi and made no attempt. He later told authorities the sounds lasted approximately 4 minutes and were rhythmic and wet. The bear eventually backed off, circled twice at a low crouch, and moved into denser forest after a brief hesitation at close range before withdrawing into cover. Ravi did not move again. Prakash climbed a ridge to find mobile signal and reached emergency services. Forest rescue personnel arrived 1 hour and 12 minutes after the call, and by then it was too late. He was dead on the spot. Autopsy revealed extensive lacerations to the face, scalp, and upper chest, bilateral orbital fractures, depressed skull fracture across the frontal and left parietal regions. The cause of death was traumatic brain injury from blunt and compressive force consistent with a large animal attack. Park officials issued a brief advisory following the incident, cautioning against improvised deterrence. The cologne bottle was recovered near the site, still mostly full. This was so stupid. Ravi walked past a posted warning, dismissed a local's direct gesture, and approached a wild animal at close range holding homemade spray he had never even field tested. Now all these stories are people misusing bear spray. However, this last one haunts me, because she did everything right. It was October 6th, 2013, in the foothills west of Sundre, Alberta. The elk rut was winding down. The bears were gorging before denning, and somewhere in the timber above the Clearwater drainage, a woman who had walked these hills for 20 years was about to discover that experience offers no guarantees. Martha Ellery was 42, a part-time hunting guide operating out of Sundre, who spent the other half of her year working dispatch for a wildlife management contractor. She carried bear spray on every trip, drilled her clients on what to do if things went sideways, and had a reputation among local outfitters for being methodical and unsentimental. This particular October trip was a 5-day ungulate hunt with 3 paying clients from Ontario, 2 brothers and a colleague. None of them unfamiliar with the bush, but none of them familiar with this country. The foothills west of Sundre compress into long, timbered ridges, broken by creek drainages, choked with willow and buffalo berry shrub, exactly the habitat a grizzly bear uses in the weeks before freeze-up. Grizzly bears in late hyperphagia are not the same animals encountered in early summer. A sow with cubs in October has spent months accumulating fat reserves and is operating under a level of defensive aggression that has no equivalent among North American wildlife. Martha had received an advisory the week before. Grizzly activity was elevated in the Sundre foothills, with 2 livestock kills within 12 kilometers of her route. She noted it, but didn't change plans. Her clients had come from Ontario, and the weather window was narrow, typical trade-offs that usually don't matter. On the morning of the 6th, the group moved through dense willows along a creek when one brother stopped to glass uphill. The wind shifted and swirled. Martha kept about 20 feet of spacing and used quiet voice checks in the thick cover, but the sow was already at close range, partially hidden and closing fast. Her cubs broke upslope. No bluff or warning. She was committed and covered the distance instantly. Martha had the spray off her hip in under 2 seconds. She deployed a full burst directly into the animal's path, and witnesses behind her saw the cloud expand forward, then drift left as the wind shifted again. The sow hit the spray cloud at an oblique angle, taking partial exposure across her muzzle and left eye, but she did not stop. She covered the remaining distance and struck Martha across the upper chest and left shoulder with her right forepaw, dropping her immediately onto her back. The impact was audible to the client standing behind her at a greater distance. Contact was forceful and immediate. The sow struck high with a forepaw, impacting Martha across the upper chest and left shoulder, driving her backward to the ground. As Martha fell, the bear followed through, pinning her with body weight and delivering a bite to the left arm, clamping above the elbow and shaking in a short, violent motion, consistent with a neutralizing response. Martha rolled partially onto her front under the force, and the sow shifted her grip, placing her jaws at the back of the neck and base of the skull. Witnesses described a single, sustained bite with downward pressure before release. The bear disengaged abruptly after that contact, lifting off and moving laterally back into the willows rather than pursuing further. The cubs were no longer visible, and the sow's retreat path aligned with where they had fled moments earlier. One client reached the radio and raised emergency dispatch, while the other 2 pulled Martha onto higher ground. Response teams arrived by off-road vehicle in 33 minutes. Martha was unconscious and had lost significant blood volume. She died before the evacuation reached the paved road. The coroner's report noted blunt force trauma to the thorax, bilateral rib fractures, severe lacerations and crush injury to the left arm, and a fatal compression fracture to the cervical spine at C2, consistent with a large predator's bite grip. Martha Ellery knew about grizzly country. She respected it. The wind shifted and moved through the drainage in ways that could not be fully predicted, and it scares me to think none of that preparation was enough.